What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Homie Hangout, where we help others move in excellence. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this Norway prison project, right? And how it's being implemented in California and elsewhere in the country, but specifically California. And I'm going to come at this from a couple different angles. The first is in 2019, I actually got to meet with these folks from Norway. They were sponsored by UCSF or programs associated with UCSF, and they had been brought over here to kind of do a tour, right? And go to different academic institutions and talk to folks. And then also go to different prisons and try to see where they might be able to sort of fit in and influence with their model how, corrections is done in other places in the country. And they gave this whole PowerPoint, right? I'll put some pictures up throughout the video, but they gave this whole PowerPoint and explained their model and the whole idea of you go to court to be punished, but you go to prison to learn how to be a good neighbor, and which is it's a great line, but it's just not realistic for how prisons work here. But so at the end of it, there's maybe like 30, 40 people in attendance, most of them professors, some from other colleges, right? Program people, and which I was kind of surprised by. I thought maybe more students would be there, but so people are asking questions, but they're not even necessarily questions. They're more just commenting, right, about how bad the prison system here is and how great their model is, and this is what's wrong with America, and yes, you guys are needed, and just a bunch of kind of classic liberal patting themselves on the back type stuff. And noticeably, none of the people talking weren't formerly incarcerated in California, Norway, or anywhere else, right? So I raised my hand, after, a lot of people had said their part. And I said, hey, how are police viewed in your country by the general public? And they said, oh, man, it's an upstanding profession, right? They're just kind of one of the people. There's no real distinction. There's no stigma. Now, to be a police officer there, it takes a lot more than to be one here. There's a university specifically for police officers, and you got to go to that for 3 years, get a bachelor's degree. There's only one police force, so it's not a whole, but, the feds and immigration and county cops and city cops and state troopers and all this. It's just one police force, one unified body of police officers. Now, there's different little squads within there that kind of specialize more in one area or another. But regardless, they're all cops. And they're all up under the same umbrella, same uniform, same name. And I thought that was interesting. And it probably makes it to where if the leadership at the top of the food chain is like healthy, mindful, productive leadership, then you stand a better chance of kind of controlling the officers as well, but also it's an investment, like it's a real career. You go to college, you learn about all sorts of stuff. And so I thought that was interesting. They get paid well. But the police don't see it as their job to be a visible presence in everybody's life, right? They'll protect embassies if there's a threat of terrorism, kind of a show of force. If there's a big protest or something, they'll show up in numbers to kind of keep an eye on that, make sure it doesn't get carried away. But otherwise, they're not patrolling neighborhoods, and pulling people over because you look suspicious type stuff. I'm sure that happens once in a while because people are people, but it is way outside the norm there. And cops live in the areas where they tend to patrol, right? Their jurisdiction is nationwide, but they tend to hang out in the place where they live. And so everybody knows them. And they don't look at people who break the law as the enemy. It's just a very different mindset, a very different culture. And their prison system then kind of mirrors that, right? Where their staff ratio in the prisons is 1 to 1.1, right? So for every 10 inmates, you have 9 COs in essence, right? So it's almost 1 for 1. And in I don't know exactly what it is in California, but I can guarantee you it's not that. It's, the federal system, it's like between 5 to 1 and 10 to 1, depending on what federal prison you go to. And those are considered acceptable numbers. I would imagine California is somewhere in that same range. Hector, just kind of off track for a second, but Hector Bravo, that prison guard, he's done some videos the last couple of days about this incident at Salinas Valley, and I'm going to talk about that also. But if it's a conversation you guys would like to see him and I maybe have on camera, be happy to do that. Him and I have talked about it a little bit because we have different perspectives, but I think also sort of similar. But anyway, so my question to them was, how can you take your model of prison and plug it in here when our society and our culture and our entire world, right, of our area is so radically different than over there? Their violent crime rate is minimal. Violence against officers, they've had 12 officers that have lost their life in the line of duty in Norway since the end of World War II. You've had 15 that have lost their life in a matter of a handful of years in Chicago. And Chicago has like half the population of Norway, right? It's just a different world, different economic model, right? You got the almost free healthcare, you got free college. They're not the type of capitalists that Americans are. And so something I've heard people point out and actually got addressed in this conversation that I had with them was this idea of, oh, well, over there in Norway, it's just all white people. It's just a homogenous population, and that's part of the difference. They don't have any diversity, right? And that's the farthest thing from the truth, because you have to remember that this American concept, like black, white, Asian, this and that, that's pretty unique to us, right? And the United States has exported that a little bit, but it's a different racial category system than ever existed in the history of the world. And a lot of parts of the world, in particular the more educated ones, don't embrace it at all. So in Norway, if you're looking from an American lens, yeah, you're like, oh, it's just a bunch of white people, but they don't see it that way, right? They see it ethnic diversity, regional diversity, national diversity, religious diversity, right? So they just view things differently. And so they would say, nah, we actually have a pretty diverse society. It's just if you line everybody up, they kind of look similar because they come from similar parts of the world, a lot of them, right? They have a lot of other people from other parts of the world, but I don't want to get too off track on that. Maybe that whole conversation will be for another day, but back to the prison model thing. So after the presentation, I want them hanging out with these guys, right? Had a few beers with them, ate some peanuts, had some pizza, and just hung out and chopped it up. And it was a very enlightening conversation. I shared with them about some of my experiences in the California Department of Corrections. The idea of the SHU program is lost on them. Like, to them, that is absolute torture, right? It makes no sense. Because over there, the inmates get like essentially your own little studio apartment, or sometimes you share it with somebody, but the housing is intended to resemble housing outside of prison. They've actually won international design awards, right? Interior design awards. Their prisons have. You ain't gonna say that about California, right? And the idea is to as closely mirror society as possible and teach people how to operate and navigate in that space so that it's not a huge leap when they come home. And it makes sense there. But there's also not a stigma in society. If you get out of prison, people aren't looking at you crazy. People aren't like, oh, I don't want to hire you, or, oh, you must be a bad guy. They don't view it that way. Just their society, their culture is different. And all of that, I think, really matters when you talk about how you're going to operate in a prison. Last year, I think it was, there was a group, I don't remember the name, but it was some international group that supports folks that work in corrections, right? Like an advocacy group for them, but nationwide, not just, this prison union, that prison union. And they went out there, right? 25, 30 of them went out to Norway to go check it out. And the biggest takeaways that they came away with, right, is the relationship between the administration and the frontline staff, right? So, um, Hector Bravo, he talks a lot about that disconnect between the COs and the administration in Sacramento, or the wardens and the higher ups. And apparently that's common in a lot of states here, but in Norway, that's not an issue. And it's in their constitution that unions have to be respected and have to have a seat at the table. Like you have to work it out, and you have to be on the same page. And they do that just naturally. That's how they operate. So there's not a disconnect between the administration and the COs, right? And that creates for a better working environment, the whole 9 yards. The staff ratio, again, right, is the whole damn near 1-to-1, is unseen in the United States, right, and in particular in California. But that's just unheard of. We also incarcerate a lot more people than they do, right? But again, if we're talking comparing models, these are some significant differences. And then the training, right? The training and the support that they get over there to become a CO. So it's 3 years to be a cop, right? It's 2 years in college to be a CO. So you, and then after that, you're on like this probationary period where you're actually kind of, on the job training after damn near 2 years in the classroom. So again, they expect a lot of their workers, right? Of their version of COs, but they train them and then equip them. And I think in the hiring process, the recruitment and the hiring process, you weed out a lot of people who just wouldn't be good for that job, and you take those who are naturally inclined to be good to the job, and then you give them the training and the schooling and the support and the coworkers and the environment and the leadership to where they don't get so burnt out on the job, to where they don't get so jaded, to where they don't feel like it's us against them, right? And all of that is very different than in California for sure, and I think most of the country. So those were their takeaways in terms of, wow, this is the stuff we like the most, but these are also the things that ain't gonna happen here, right? Like it would take decades and decades and decades, a radical restructuring of corrections to get anywhere close to any of that. And those that are currently in the job are gonna lose their marbles, right? What you mean I gotta go to college all of a sudden for 2 years when I've been on the job for 10? It ain't gonna happen, right? And unions are adversarial here, so it's different. But anyways, those changes, those differences I think are meaningful, right? And they agreed, in our conversation, they were like, man, that's a good point. And even sentencing, their courts. In Norway, your maximum sentence is 21 years. It don't matter what you do. 21 years is the top. Then they have this thing called preventative sentencing or preventative incarceration, where they can hold you at a maximum of like 5-year increments. So kind of like going to board, right? You go to board and they could deny you 5 years at a time if you haven't shown that you're rehabilitated. If you haven't demonstrated that you would be a good neighbor yet, then they can hold you longer. But the vast majority of people demonstrate that they're able to be a good neighbor, and their recidivism rate is amongst the lowest in the world, right? Like hardly anybody gets out of prison in Norway and breaks the law and goes back to prison. It's incredibly rare, again, very different than it is here. But without that support and all that love, basically, I wouldn't expect people to, because naturally we don't want to be criminals, right? Criminality is in large part a product of your environment, and we all got to take responsibility for our own actions, but people aren't born criminals, right? That's the incredibly rare mental health case. And they also have mandatory psych treatment too, where if you're just JCATted out, right, and I'm going to tie that back to Salinas Valley here in a minute, if you're just JCATting out, you don't even do the whole incarceration thing, rehabilitation thing. You go to the mental hospital because you're not capable of getting your life on track as long as you're JCATting off. So you go over there, and hopefully they help you not, JCAT out, and then you can learn the skills you need to move forward. So again, very different than here. We're here, JCats go to prison, right? So anyways, different culture. Now let's look at Salinas Valley, okay? Salinas Valley has these couple buildings, right? These 5 and 6 building, C facility. And that is the transitional thing. I don't remember the exact name they have for it. That prison guard talked about it, but essentially that's the Norway project, but they call it the California project, right? And that's the model that they have there. But here's the thing that makes zero sense, right? It's all the most difficult management cases in prison, primarily mental health, like JCats, EOP guys, folks that have a ridiculous number of staff assaults and gassing people and just non-programming people, right? It's almost like they're taking the most difficult people and putting them in this program. But what do you do in this program? They're like, oh, we want to be like Norway. We want to make it like a living thing. And so you're not really in your cell, right? The guards are now trained to deal with you in the same way that staff in Norway is trained to deal with their inmates. But again, it's a whole different culture. And these guards aren't going to college for 2 years to do it, right? They're just getting kind of brush up training, right? Like, oh, this is how you be emotional, emotionally intelligent, and this is how you be sensitive, and this trauma-informed care, which is a huge buzzword in nonprofit circles and now government circles because they overlap, right? COs in California are not prepared to offer trauma-informed care. And our prison system and our prison population just moves different. So it's not about, man, I really understand what in your childhood led you to become like this. That's not the CO's job, right? And you can't expect them to do that job. So, and I'm going to compare this with San Quentin in a minute, but so they have this program. They got Nintendo Wii's. There's stories. I don't know exactly who, right? But there's stories of lifers getting ankle monitors and being able to leave the prison grounds and see their family and that kind of stuff. And then they come back to the prison, right? See, that stuff happens in Norway. But again, California moves a little different, man. And the people that they're taking, initially it was supposed to be folks that only had a couple years left. And so it was like a really enhanced re-entry program, right? Instead of watching little stupid videos and filling out these little workbooks like I did for my re-entry when I was in the SHU, they're trying to make it more substantive. But in reality, there's dudes here that they're not going home anytime soon. Their behavior is off the hook. I know people in prison, right, in the general population, and they're not being invited to be in this program. That option is not available to them. And they got far less points, far less staff assaults. Of course, they've gotten in trouble over time, or they've been to the SHU and that kind of stuff, but they've been down decades, But they have families out there. They have kids. They have jobs lined up. They have all these going for them. And that little extra boost of being in an environment to start to prepare you to be independent, because that's the main thing that Norway does, is it stresses independence, right? Hey, you kind of effed off your independence. That's why you're here. But let's train you to be better at being independent, and because that's what you're going to have to be when you get out there. You're going to have to cook your own food. You're going to have to wash your own clothes. You're going to have to pay your own bills. You're going to have to work. That's what it takes to be a grown-up. So let's prepare you to do that now. And I think a lot of these dudes that are incarcerated that are coming home in a matter of a couple of years could really benefit from that. And Salinas is just off the hook. The way they're doing it, I've seen the little videos. Apparently, a CO got assaulted over there a couple days ago, and that's why that prison guard has been doing videos about it. And it's insane. Nothing about that makes sense, but I'm going to tell you why I think it's happening, okay? Now, compare that, and I'll wrap this video up here. I think it's getting a little long. San Quentin, right? San Quentin State Prison, which is now San Quentin Rehabilitation Center, or whatever they're going to call it. I'm actually not as critical of that. right? Personally, San Quentin has been incorporating some of the principles of the Norway prison model before the people from Norway ever came out here, right? But San Quentin is a different animal, right? For one, it's situated in the Bay Area. So you have a ton of nonprofits around there with access to the prison. You have a more liberal mindset in the population around the prison, right? And so that helps. You know, the do-gooders want to go in there and help people, but some of them are really qualified. And some of the programs that they've done, and I've taken those, like the Vogue training and the grip training, and that, you know, I've done all that. I've facilitated those things at times, you know, for guys inside, and there's a lot of value to them. There's a lot of other ones that are not so valuable, right? But people are getting cashed out to come in and provide courses. And early on, when there wasn't a lot of people that wanted to provide services, I think the prison kind of opened the doors to anybody and anything. But as time has gone on, they're starting to learn, hey, this shit right here really works, and this stuff right here doesn't. And that's a good thing, right? But it's an entire prison. It's a level 2 prison. It's a prison that has not been hardcore by California standards since the 80s, right? Really. And so it's not a war zone, you know, and it hasn't been a war zone for a long time. And then, you know, once they flipped the population and now it's an SNY joint, it's really, but it's like a calm SNY prison. I hear about some of these other folks that have been on SNY yards and they talk about all the violence and craziness and everything else. San Quentin ain't like that, but because they get a lot of rewards in San Quentin, right? There's a lot of opportunities. And a lot of people coming home from San Quentin don't reoffend. A lot of people coming home from San Quentin get lined up with jobs, get lined up with mentorship outside, get lined up with housing in the area of the country that's hard for anybody to afford, right? They get all that stuff. But also the curriculums, the teachings, that stuff works because these are level-headed gentlemen, right? These are self-aware, kind of intuitive, thoughtful guys, right? They can put 2 and 2 together. And so they're taking these classes and these workshops and whatnot. And that information is very good information. I've learned a lot from that, you know, being out of prison and studying some of that stuff and learning some of that stuff and going through the trainings. That stuff really does make you an all-around, more well-rounded, just human being, right? And if anything, that's closest to, you know, when Norway says, like, hey, you come to prison to learn to be a good neighbor. It's those classes that break down the criminality and break down what's behind it and the trauma-informed care as a side group, not as a matter of corrections, not as a matter of, oh, you know, you're probably traumatized when I yell at you and tell you to go in your cell, so let me not yell at you and tell you to go in your cell. You can't do that because then nobody's going to go in their fucking cell, right? Like, this stuff shouldn't be rocket science. But those little side groups, those little side circles where you build community and go over stuff, that's great, right? And there's a lot of amazing practitioners, like I said, and maybe I'll have someone on the channel one day and they could talk about it. But so San Quentin, I think, is working. But that's not, you're not going to make Salinas Valley like San Quentin. And San Quentin is not taking the approach that these JCATs, in terms of administration, are taking in Salinas. You know, where they're getting the most difficult people possible. And then be like, man, if we just be really friendly with you, you're going to be ready to be out on the streets in no time. No, it's not working. So why is this happening? Money. It's money. Academic institutions, government, nonprofits. It's a financial circle jerk, right? I think that's a technical term. The food coming into Salinas Valley, excuse me, the food coming into Salinas Valley is federally paid for these guys, for the California Project people or whatever, right? Like, they have access to stuff nobody else does. The feds are paying for that. Why would the feds pay for that, right? It's not for nothing. It's this, again, politicians, government, academic institutions that get these research dollars and get these big grants from the government and everything else, right, to go travel to Norway. All these trips to Norway, they're expensive, right? Who's paying for that? academic institutions. Then they bring some politicians out there, and the politicians are like, man, this is a great idea. Well, I'm part of the government, so I can go get government money, and all this is going to be great for my career or great for whatever, or I can leverage this because now this program is going to come into this prison, but I'm going to get money from that, right? It's all financial, and I don't pretend to be able to absolutely connect every single dot along the way, but I've been involved with high-level academic institutions. I've been involved at a high level with nonprofits. And anybody that's kind of observing sees how this works, right? And that's what it is. It's money. It's folks are getting their pockets lined, and that's why this is happening. And I think it's unfortunate because on some level, the more this stuff happens and the more things go left, right? The more it's going to look like, oh, well, our entire prison population is just incorrigible. We're just unable to rehabilitate. We're unable. And I firmly disagree. Absolutely, most folks that are incarcerated are perfectly capable of transforming their lives in there, renewing their mindsets, getting healthy mentally, emotionally, spiritually, right, physically, and coming out and being productive members of society. There's a lot of us that do that. We don't get the attention, right? The recidivism gets the attention. The folks doing life on the installment plan get the attention. The people who put themselves out there as a poster child for these different nonprofits and different organizations and whatnot, they get the attention. But most of us don't fit in those categories, right? And I've been in that role before. Don't get me wrong. I don't think it's a bad thing. But most people I know that came home from prison and got their life together, they work, man, right? And I mean, I got a job too, but, they don't get into all the public stuff or whatever. They're a voice of reason to the young folks in their family or their immediate circle, right? Their nephews or whatever. They look out for their brother or their cousin when he comes out and try to, look, man, you need to get your shit together. But they work. They raise their kids. Sometimes they spend money. They get toys, motorcycles and boats, and they travel, and they're living their best life, right? And a lot of them, you wouldn't even know that they were incarcerated, unless you see the tattoos or something. That happens every day in California and around the country, But the more that these high-profile things are brought out there, and then they backfire because they're done improperly at their core, the more then the political backlash from the other side comes, and it's like, see, can't do nothing with these guys. Just lock them up. Just lock them up. And that's not the answer, right? That's not the answer. I'm all for rehabilitative programming in prison. I'm all for what San Quentin's doing, But this train wreck in Salinas Valley and other places it's just more issues waiting to happen, man. And we need to come to grips with our culture as a whole, right? Not ethnic culture, racial culture, any of that other stuff, but our culture in the United States of how we look at policing and how we look at corrections and how we look at reform and how we look at our judicial system. And if we want the benefits of a country like Norway, then we got to be willing to make the broader societal changes that allows them to operate the way that they do, right? But there's no appetite for that in this country. We're too busy being divided and picking at each other over these bullshit political parties or physical differences or, nonsense, man, to really turn our attention towards the folks in power that keep things this way, right? So anyways, help others move in excellence, man. That's what homies do. Help yourself at the same time because you're worth it. Help your community because they need you. And yeah, leave me a comment if you want to see me and that prison guard have this conversation, or leave a comment on his channel, man. Go check out his last couple videos too. You guys take care.